Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Sending gratitude to all of you who are joining in today to accompany us down the rabbit hole of self-exploration through plant medicines. My name is Ryan Sprague, and I'm here to tell you that your frequency is now set and tuned to explore psychedelic medicines and the impact they've made among the countless psychonauts exploring the last true frontier. Buy a ticket and take the ride with me as we get true first-hand accounts of the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place within the ever-expanding world of psychedelic medicines on This One Time on Psychedelics. For anyone who has had the opportunity to experience the powers of DMT, you know full well what this experience can bring forth. This being said, for many people, this medicine can create a lot of anxiety as it comes on intense and fast, and also, due to the fast and strong nature of it, it can leave many individuals puzzled as to how to contextualize their experience and how to then integrate from it. Today's guest on the show is a returning guest who is a pioneer in the realms of cannabis, psilocybin, ketamine, and DMT. And in this episode, we will be focusing primarily upon his most recent venture, DMTX. DMTX is an extended state DMT experience in which the individual moving through the experience can be brought into the effects of the medicine in a slower, controlled manner, and also be kept in that state longer than with other forms, such as when smoking DMT. He has been working on this project for quite some time, and his overarching business, the Center For Medicinal Mindfulness, has been a long-time juggernaut in the plant medicine space, and helping its clients not only benefit from the powers of cannabis and now psilocybin, ketamine, and DMT, but also allow them to receive training in how to replicate these results for others as well. So please help me in welcoming my man Daniel McQueen back onto the show. The one, the only Daniel McQueen. It is so amazing to have you back with me, brother. How you been?
Yeah, doing pretty good, Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. You know, we were just catching up, and a lot's happened in the last 4 months since I've had you on. You know, you've released DMTX. I know that's been a project in the works for a long time. You know, give us a quick overview of just some of the highlights of the last 4 months. And then, of course, we're going to dive into DMTX and some of these things in much deeper value. But just give me an update of how things have been. You just got back from that Psychedelic conference out in, what was it, Denver?
Yeah, the Psychedelic Sciences Conference with MAPS. Yeah, that was huge.
Yeah.
Gosh, what hasn't happened in the last 4.5 months? I think, you know, some of the big things, we've integrated psilocybin mushrooms into our clinic, and that's been quite lovely since the new Natural Medicine Health Act had passed. And we're starting to bring in DMT. That's like a little bit slower process, but that's happening too. And then we did a DMTX retreat, or sometime in May, I think. It's been a little while. And we're starting to integrate 4 medicines into our training program. So all really big stuff. Cannabis still is the backbone of our program. And personally, I think and hope will always be, but it's lovely to have access to a family of medicines. It seems to be making a huge difference for our clients and stuff. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm excited to share what we've been up to. So, you know, thanks for having me on, Ryan.
Absolutely, man. Anytime. And, you know, I'm fascinated by this because I've connected with DMT, NN, and 5-MeO. And I'm curious, like with the DMTX, are you focusing on one particular type of DMT? Is it either one? Tell me a little bit about that.
So what a big conversation. So DMTX is short for extended state DMT, where we see this infusion pump right here.
Yes.
That's an infusion pump that's used in anesthesia and other medical purposes, and also with some ketamine treatments. So we put the DMT through this infusion pump, and it's in DMT. 5-MeO is possible, but we don't have access to that for like above board work and things. So it's all in DMT. And the idea is, instead of shooting off with a smoked version or vape version, where you only have a few minutes on the other side, this process allows the experience to slowly come on and to stay in the space in these really peak states for extended periods of time. And it was a game changer. You know, I'm happy to share more about that. But it's in DMT. So lots of entity encounters and hyper vivid, colorful, you know, all of the things. But people are reaching these states with it that are even beyond that, like more like 5-MeO. So, you know.
Wow. That is wild, man. I mean, I've had quite a few, like probably about 5 or 6 experiences with NN and 2 with 5-MeO. The 2 with 5-MeO were much more professional in nature. The NN was just me younger, just trying to blast off. And one of the things that I've always had happen with NN, and this could be, I imagine it leads to the quality of it, setting a lot of different things, but I've always gotten very tight tension with NN DMT, right? Like especially in the back of my skull. And, of course, I was smoking it when I was doing this, and with 5-MeO, I didn't have that. And that was in a vaporizer. It was basically in like one of those pens that they had like different grades and you would slowly go up. And I like what you were talking about, how like it's a little bit of a slower onset, like because one of the biggest challenges with DMT, at least for me, is just how fast it is. Once I'm there, I'm fine. And once I'm back to normal, I'm fine. But that like werewolf stage in the middle, where like, you're starting to vibrate, but you're still a human with an ego. Poof, man, that's an interesting, definitely an interesting time period.
It really is. Like, it takes a lot to surrender into something that's so overwhelming and, not always scary, but just so big, right? Like it's just hard for our psyches to fully surrender. And so that's not an uncommon theme of like this tension or just like a part of our psyche or self gets stuck and can't let go. And it's just outside of our conscious control. And so imagine, instead of just smoking it with like, I would consider that like a rocket ship, right? Like, of course you're going to be nervous if you're literally stepping into a rocket ship. And of course you're going to be nervous on the liftoff, right? Like, I think that's totally human. And so imagine it being more like a glide where you're rising up gently. And we're exploring, like we could do the blast offs with the extended state, but we're really exploring this kind of stepping stone or like a ladder where we put the person into an altered state that's not as high as they could go. And we call it, like in DMT, they call it the waiting room space, which is kind of like this kind of terminal place before you go into the other realms. And so what we're trying to do is put people in this waiting room space and then leave them in there. And what happens is their heart rates start calming down, their defenses start to acclimate to it, and they start to soften around the experience a little bit. And then from there, we can bump it up again. It's really fascinating. And dare I say, like a really advanced protocol to work with the medicine, there's something unique about it.
Oh, for sure. It's funny because the only time I had ever heard about DMT through an IV drip was that Vice documentary that came out years ago, back when, Vice was different than they are now. We'll just say that. But they had that video or that like documentary called Inside the LSD Palace. And it was that guy, Todd. I forget his name, but the girl that wrote Lysergic, she was like I think she was a stripper, and he met her. He was like well off. I don't know how, but and he bought an underground bunker somewhere in like Kansas or something. And he was doing it. Yeah, exactly. He was doing it back then, and I don't think he was doing anything like you're doing with like, actually like measuring out doses and things like that. I think he was just going for it. But it's very interesting stuff because in order for DMT specifically to be like more, I don't want to use the term mainstream, but more like normalized, like a lot of people are not going to want that blast off experience, right? And so it would miss the opportunity to have a lot of people potentially benefit from it if that were the only option. Plus also smoking it, right? Like a lot of people don't want to smoke, right? And I don't blame them necessarily, right? So at the end of the day, like this is a much, I think, more efficient and effective way to be able to utilize the medicine that is DMT without having to necessarily have a lot of the potential biggest challenges, right? Like you were saying, like once someone is acclimated to the waiting room, then they can go deeper and they're already out of that super sympathetic response. That's like for me, like I get super sympathetic when I first do it. And it's just like, I can't even grasp the experience because I'm just trying to like regulate my nervous system if I even remember I have one, So yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's hard to regulate your nervous system when you're being like thrown through a wormhole in a barrel, and that's the experience for a lot of people. It's really great. And even the entities, for lack of a better word, on the other side have appreciated the slow uptake because what they said, and again, like, taking all of that with a grain of salt. But what they said was they appreciated us knocking on their door as opposed to barging through and just popping into their spaces unannounced. So we're playing with this idea that the entities there's a chance the entities are somehow objectively real. We want to be considerate. Like, if you wanted to knock on somebody's door or meet a stranger, you're not going to like break their door down and enter their home and say, hello, I'm here to be your friend. It's a really confusing space for them, So I think it's normal. And I think that sympathetic response you're describing is like, we can train for it, right? Like psychonauts can train for that. But it's still, like, if you can dial it in a way that doesn't require it, why not do that, right? And the other thing that we found is that people are able to retain their whole, and this is similar with DMT, but even more so with the DMTX, is able to retain their identity, their ego functioning. Like they're still, like you'd still be Ryan. You don't like you can become one with the universe and the fabric of existence, but you're still like, you keep your identity intact. And I think that is also helpful for people to not just like completely merge with the universe, So it's been fascinating,
Have you chatted with Hamilton Souther yet? I forget. I think, you guys know each other. I always forget that. So, he talks a lot about this. He's like, because we talked a lot about ego death during our episode together. And he was like, people think this thing like, ego death is this like cool thing. And really, like, you don't want your ego to be fully dead most of the time anyway, because you're not going to be able to like have an experience of individuation, remember the experience. You're just going to be a puddle of goo, right? And like, there might be like a positive to that, but it's not like the only thing that positivity in the psychedelic space comes from, right? It's not like, if you don't absolutely obliterate your ego, you're not going to benefit. It's actually usually opposite. It's harder, at least in my case, to benefit when I've completely obliterated, because I have to really like figure out like, what did I experience? How do I contextualize that information and make sense of it? And then how do I actually integrate it, right? Or if I still have an ego from which to at least like, even if it's like a mile away, right? Like, I've had that experience many times where like, it's not full on right here, but I can like remember like, oh yeah, I remember this life that I had, right? So like, it allows you to actually have the experience without just being part of the all, So yeah, I like that a lot.
No, that makes sense. I haven't talked to Hamilton directly, but he is talking. One of my friends who's part of the team reached out to him, and he actually helped us make our extraction even more potent, which was really cool thing of him to do. But I agree with him. So I have a clinical background too, and blowing out your ego over and over again is just not healthy for a human being. So ego is a complex word. So just to Can I dial this in a little bit? Like, so there's like ego strength, like the ability to engage the world as a human being, right? Like, I have to be somebody to do the things in the world. And then there's something like ego, like big ego, and people talk about wanting to let go of their ego, right? So that's a little bit of a different space. So as human beings, we need ego strength. And sometimes they can be maladaptive. This ego strength can be maladaptive. And what the psychedelics do, well, they make the brain more malleable and turn off the default mode network so that you can at least consider an alternative way of being. And I think that's really healthy. Now, if you overdo it, or you're not integrating these experiences or overuse and things, what happens is it starts to break down healthy ego functioning. And that's where things get a little wonky. And so what happens is two things. There's an ego inflation and an ego deflation at the same time. So ego deflation means my functionality in the world just isn't quite as up to par as it could be. But ego inflation means I think I'm the shit. So even though I'm not functioning as well, like this, sometimes like the ego, like aggrandizement or something gets a little inflated. And so it's real. So people who are overusing with psychedelics is something we really have to pay attention to. So that's why we talk about safety and like right relationship to frequency of use, And there was something like DMT or extended state DMT. What we've seen, like we get a lot of emails from people who are really overusing with DMT can be really weird, like not the healthiest, right? So really paying attention to how we work with that medicine, because it's just like when your whole worldview changes in a matter of minutes, like that can be a little derailing for someone, like existential, like radical shifts in worldviews happen in a matter of minutes. And there's no, like, that's kind of permanent. Like you can't forget what you saw or whatever. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like when Pandora's box has been opened, it's impossible to put it back in the way that it was before. Right. And like, you think about this with anything, right? Like, I think a lot of people that like aren't necessarily in this realm, which wouldn't apply to anyone in this podcast, but like, I think that like the people at large, like these more qualitative things like that aren't tangible, like the ego, it's tangible, but like, you can't hold it. You can't see like, oh, those are all the components. It's objective from person to the next. But like, think about it for anything, right? Like, if you are not that good of a driver, are you going to get into a car with 1,000 horsepower? No, because you haven't integrated the ability to be able to drive that car and be smart and know how to turn it and everything, right? But if you drove a Honda Civic and then maybe you upgraded to like a Subaru STI and then you like continued to get a little bit deeper, and on the way you also went to say racing school, right? And then you practiced a lot and you found out where your weaknesses were. Like all of these things are like the same idea or idea as integration, right? Like this idea, and I'm really big on this word because it gets thrown around everywhere. And I think a lot of people, including myself for many years, like we just throw it out and we're like, oh yeah, we're like walking, we're journaling, we're integrating. It's like, well, the whole idea of integration is to like actually stop and make sense of what that worldview change was, right? And apply it to different aspects of your life so that you can be aware of the new pattern or patterns that you're looking to implement, but also the old patterns. Because whenever you're trying to implement something new is the time in which the old thing has the biggest opportunity to continue cock blocking you, basically. You know what I mean? So like, that's why it can be really helpful to have like, a clinic like yours, right? Like it's what I do with coaching, like, because having someone else that can not only hold you accountable, but also like hear these things and catch you before you wreck yourself can be super handy, And I think a lot of people like, with psychedelics getting so popular, they think once again, like, oh, I'm just going to keep hitting the button. And the more I hit the button, the better it will be, And it's very similar with like even the gym, right? Like people that start going to the gym are like, I'll go 3 times a day. And then they get tendonitis all over their body. And like, I thought this was supposed to be healthy. It's like, it is, but you got to integrate it.
Yeah, do it at a pace that makes sense objectively. Yeah, I really like I like your analogy of the racing car. So, and I would put that in terms of like just skill development and resiliency development, right? Like your nervous system has to catch up with what you want to do. And you can train to do that. Like F-16 fighter pilots, right? Like they're trained to be cool under pressure, like extreme pressure, right? They can do things that I can't imagine. Astronauts, like hurling through space at hundreds of thousands of miles an hour, right? Like, I don't know. I'm not interested in keeping my cool in that situation because I'm just not going to go there.
Same.
But psychedelics are that same way. But you can have these states, you can have these experiences where you perceive the potential of who you can be, and sometimes people misinterpret that potential of a future possibility as fact right now. And that's what I mean by like that ego inflation thing. It's like, oh, I experienced racing that car and I didn't die, therefore I must be an expert. The reality is, well, the medicine was driving you, and you had a lot of support around that. And so I think that's a really good analogy. And I think there's not really quick fixes. I wish I could say you could just take these medicines and be better. And sometimes people can reset in good ways, but then that's when the real work begins. Like they have to reorient to a healthier lifestyle or a way of being or clean up old messes. And that all takes time, So I totally agree with you there.
What I always tell people is it's kind of like if you are looking to retire, you can either retire and then be like, okay, I'm retired, but I got no fucking savings, right? Like, holy shit, right? Which is like, let's say the average person has like an experience where like, oh shit, something shifted. But now they're going back to an environment where they're not in the right relationship. Maybe they're in an abusive relationship. They're not eating healthy food. They're working a job they don't like. In that environment, they're going to have a lot of work to do, right? Versus, let's say someone is already really healthy. They have a really positive relationship or relationships in their life of, friends that support them, et cetera. They've, done a lot of work on themselves, coaching, therapy, et cetera. And now they have a blowout experience, right? Well, it's not that it's immediately, integrated, but they also have all the systems set up already to be like, okay, I know what to do with this, right? Like I actually know, like, first of all, I'm aware enough that just because I had this experience doesn't mean that I'm cured, which is a huge thing, like that ego inflation. Like when you can be aware, right, of that potential, right? Like you're aware of that potential. So when it happens or if it happens, you can laugh with it and be like, oh, there's that part of me that thinks I'm all figured out now. Yeah, and hey, you know what? Maybe I am a little more figured out than I give myself credit for, but I'm going to be conservative and make sure that like I'm figuring out what to do with these new parameters I'm choosing to put my life into, And I think that, that's one of the things that I think most people getting into the space, just like if they're new to it, fail to understand, especially like, I grew up going to a lot of music festivals and still do, but it's interesting going back there and just seeing like, again, no judgment, just clear discernment, but, seeing versions of me in the past, right? Like literally seeing like how I used to be like, oh, the more acid you take, the better you're going to be when you go home. Right. And it's like, well, that's like 2 + 2 = 8, like not exactly the way it works.
No, yeah. And when a guide says that, oh, just take more medicine, that's like a major red flag for me. Because for some people, so if somebody's struggling with ego strength and somebody says, oh, you should take this medicine that will repeatedly annihilate your ego, that's just never going to make them feel better. It's actually going to cause harm. But we all grow up and we all, have these stages of excitement, like I have certainly in my past, I used more psychedelics than I do now.
Same.
So I think that's just like maybe even a natural phase of like the honeymoon period with the medicine and things. But at some point you gotta shift gears a little bit. So
definitely.
And then just to reflect back what you said, like we work with people who have healthy families and lifestyles, and we also work with people who are really trying to pull out of unhealthy spaces. And so when we see somebody coming into our work, maybe they're here a week, but we know they're going back to a space that's going to require a lot of transformation. Like that's when my coaching hat comes on, and like not like psychedelics aren't going to help you cope with a shitty situation. They're going to blow you out of that, and whether you want to or not. And
Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to take a quick moment to let you all know that the doors are officially open for the Conscious Cannabis Collective. And as such, this is the last week you can sign up and receive all of the bonuses we're currently including. This is the last time I will be personally onboarding those of you who sign up with a complimentary one-on-one session, and you'll have the ability to get the Grow with Cannabis course for free during this limited time. For more info on how you can take advantage of this offer, head down to the show notes for this episode and secure your spot today, as we only have so many spots left and they are filling up quickly. Now back to the show.
And it can fracture something, but sometimes things have to break a little bit before they can be pulled out of something unhealthy, right? But it is a really difficult space for a lot of folks. It's like to see that their life is no longer, it may never have been congruent with their values, right? So,
100%. Yeah, I think that's like, the crux of like the quote unquote bad trip. Like, I think really, I mean, obviously it's multifaceted, but I think one of the main things is like, oh, I didn't know what I didn't know, and now I know it and I can't go back. Right. And like, it's usually like, what I found in my own experience is when a lot or maybe even more than one big area of your life gets challenged at once, right? Like maybe you realize that you're still grieving a lost loved one. You realize you're in the wrong relationship, and you also realize you hate your job. Like when like, things compound like that, depending again on your nervous system regulation, your health, etc., the likelihood of someone having not just a challenging experience, but framing it as a bad experience goes up. And I think that's also one of the challenges of like, again, I'm very grateful that now, like, there are centers like yours, right? There's like, the things that I do. There's like these professional setups that when that happens, people are set up to be able to help people through that. Like, okay, we know what's going on here, and afterwards we can articulate and explain what happened, right? And actually like figure out things. But when people are alone, right, like, and they have no idea about that, it can definitely be rattling for sure, and I'm not saying you can't come back from it by any means, but, I had many experiences like that in my younger years before I actually really realized like, oh, this is actually all me. It's kind of like when you face the final boss and it's like, the final boss is yourself, right. And it's like, it can be scary for sure.
Yeah. The big shadow, right. For sure. Gosh, I hear you. And I think part of the clients that we attract are wanting that level of support. And we're trying to figure out just how to make it as accessible as possible through groups and things, because I think that's where the healing of the planet takes place, is like people realizing where they're out of alignment and then turning towards alignment. And like you said, like sometimes we were just working with someone not long ago, lost his mother when he was a teenager. And that led to like you described, like a stacking of processes that were out of alignment. And so, so imagine grieving for like 5 different things that each one would be enough to really break you. Yeah. And how do we hold that space for someone so that they can be held enough so that that breaking is still contained, and it's done in it's like as gentle a way possible so that they can start to mend. And I just, for those of you who have gone through that alone, just know that I have too, and other people have, and that it is possible. But at the very least, find some friends to talk to and read up about it. Like, don't stay isolated, right? Because I think that's definitely, I think the number one thing that we need right now is communities that are congruent with our values. And that's hard sometimes for psychedelic medicine folks,
100%. I think so many of us that are now like, late 20s, early 30s, we grew up with it being illegal. And even if we, and I'm speaking personally for this, like, even if we don't think we have programming around it, like, I do this work, everything like that, there is still some of it in there, And so I imagine for like the average person getting into this now, they don't really have friends maybe around them that they could talk to about this, or maybe they have shame or guilt around, the fact that they're seeking these things out, or any, number of things that can happen. And especially like being able, like, I agree with you. I think the ultimate thing that humanity needs right now is humanity, right? Like connection, community, etc. And I think that also, like, after the last couple of years of interesting times, right? Like, I think a lot of people have, quote unquote, lost a lot of people in their life, or maybe been ostracized from their families, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also this thirst trap, right? Because there's this thing called social media, where I think a lot of people's left brain can trick them into believing like, no, I have no reason to feel lonely. Like, I have 3,000 Facebook friends, right? And so, like, there's this interesting paradox going on where, before social media, if you didn't hang out with anyone, it'd be pretty easy to say, yeah, I'm lonely and I don't hang with anyone, so of course I am, but nowadays it can be like, no, I mean, like, I don't hang that with that many people, but I have all these friends I talk to online. But when you're speaking through a computer or even through a phone, you don't get the same energetic reciprocity that you do in person, and so you have people going into their shadow, into their the dark corners of their psyche, and uprooting these challenges. And then where do they talk to anyone about it, right? If they feel shame or guilt around it, or they don't know where to go to, they're just going to continue holding stuff inside, and they're going to need more psychedelics, or think they do. And it's kind of like this vicious cycle, all in good intention, right? Like, it's not like, I think most people are not going out, specifically to get fucked up or try to do this all the time. But, they find that when they get into the space, maybe they have some release, they feel better, and they don't know how to get that any other way, because they don't have any friends or family to talk to about it, to continue helping them integrate, hold them accountable. And so they just keep doing it, and it's interesting. So I have a lot of compassion for sure. I think that's why these conversations are so important.
Or even, just that, I don't know if I'd call it a trap, but I could totally see it as one, when it's out of alignment. But, like, if somebody is alone or lonely, they can take a substance and feel the connection to all things. Why wouldn't you want to do that again? Right. It's a different drug experience than something that's numbing. It's like the opposite. Yeah. And it can still be a trap. These things are neurologically affecting, to put it in as neutral of a term as possible. And so, like, integration circles, like, we have so many resources now than when I was in my 20s. I would invite anybody to just Google integration circles. There's a lot of them are free. A lot of them are like just people wanting to connect. And so, and if you can find like psychedelic clubs, psychedelic societies, just Google it in your area. You might be really surprised that there are people all over the place that are open about this now. And and then the shame and guilt piece, like, you'd be surprised, like, cannabis is still the number one that people feel that the most. And ironically, a lot of people are feeling that, they reduced their use of cannabis because of that, when that could probably be the one thing that would help them the most. And so address, and sometimes, like, that shame or guilt is so ingrained. It's from the war on drugs and Just Say No campaigns and DARE, all of that stuff. And I think that has to be healed in community. I don't think that's possible to be healed. You have to see the reflection of other people normalizing it and being okay and not being psychotic or druggies or whatever the projection is that people give us. That I think that's one of the biggest things our training program does and our circle does, is just bring people out of the proverbial medicine cabinet, so to speak, right?
Definitely.
So I'm a huge fan of community. As hard as it is, like, real community is messy. There's conflict and there's differences of opinion. And people get hurt.
That's why cannabis is so good.
Yeah.
Smoke a joint with someone. I mean, it's very hard to disagree. You could be like, "Oh, that's cool. Like, I believe this, but hey, man, I'm happy that you believe what makes you happy."
I like pot smokers. I have a general affinity towards people who consume cannabis, for sure.
Definitely. I mean, there's a certain like vacation vibration that like most people that consume cannabis, especially that's what's been so amazing about the work that we both do, right? Like, what I found over the last few years of doing this stuff is, when people are able to like connect with cannabis as an ally, as a spirit, right? Like, and are able to actually like begin learning from it. The same way as if, like, I always use this analogy, but like, imagine you had a coach for years that like you went to, let's say maybe even every day, right? And they gave you some advice, but you were just like, all right, that sounds cool. And you just went back to your life, right? That's how I learned to use cannabis, right? Like, I never even knew that it was a coach. I never viewed it like that. Every once in a while I get a idea. Didn't know what it was, didn't know it was important, didn't know I could do anything with it. So I just like chalked it up as like, oh, that's hilarious, pipe dreams. Then you start actually realizing like, wait a minute, if I start following what this coach is telling me, I can actually have a whole better life. Oh, okay. So then you start doing that, right? Like when people click into that kind of frequency with connecting with cannabis, it doesn't mean they always have to be in white robes or ceremonial. It means just like they're aware that like the plant can allow them to access higher states of consciousness. And from that area, they can know thyself to a deeper degree. And then if they learn how to integrate that, they can hold that. Like, they can start holding a new vibration, right? Like, what I found in doing that is like, those are some of my favorite people to be around, because they're very inquisitive. They're very excited to figure out what they don't know so far. They're usually much more open-minded. They're not going to be super argumentative. Like, even if they don't agree, they're just going to be like, hey, man, agree to disagree. No big deal, right? Like, because they realize, like, everything in life is subjective, right? Like, why am I going to try to tell this person they're 100% wrong, where in their subjective universe, maybe they are right? Like, we can have paradoxical truths that are both true at the same time, right? Like, I'm right and you're right, depending on, like, food's a perfect example, right? If I believe hamburgers are the best food ever, well, that's correct in my subjective universe. If you believe steak is the best food ever, that's true for you in your subjective universe. So we can have two opposing truths that are also both true and also neither true, right? So, that's why I love cannabis users, because I find when they get into that kind of realm, it's just super fun. It makes for great conversation. I mean, I learned so much from all of my students. It's really fun.
Yeah. And who's just like, I think there is some objectivity, but it's so personal, like, and who are we to tell others how to live their life, as long as they're not causing harm to someone, right? Or like explicitly harming themselves in some way. Like, I would just try to as gently as possible check in around things like that, whether or not they could receive it or not. I would at least try, but so like objectively, if all you ate was steak, like, there might be some objective health problems with that, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
So we want to move towards health and wellness, and like, man, the other, like, that's why I don't judge people for smoking pot, right? Like, because even if they're overusing cannabis, it's like, that's probably the healthiest thing they have access to help them feel a little better about where they are. And so I have a lot of gratitude for that medicine. Problem solving, like, I love the idea of a coach. Like, I built my whole program just sitting with a problem on the medicine and receiving guidance. And sometimes it sort of makes sense, but I'll at least try it. And I'm always impressed by how well it works out. And so, like, why wouldn't you want to have access to a tool that can create a relationship with a problem-solving aspect of self, right? Like, why wouldn't we want to engage that? And then to say it's bad, right? Like that's something really out of alignment with that. And I think the culture, the culture that said it was bad are the ones that are attempting to maintain control. And maybe we don't want to be controlled by these people anymore, So So I have a deep appreciation for cannabis, and it's like a very humbling space, and like as a coach, like as a coach, she's like, hey, you do you, and what if you played with this, Hey, you do, like, no judgment, no being told how to do something. You do you, and what if you tried this out, And I love that about this medicine.
Me too. That's why it's always been my ride or die. Like, not to say like psilocybin would probably be my second. Like I can rely that every time if I need a good cry, I'm going to do psilocybin. But I only need that like once a year, really. You know what I mean? Like I alchemize all my crying through laughter. I've like realized this over the past like 5 years of doing inner work. Like I had a story for a long time that I couldn't cry. And really it was just like, no, you just laugh all the time. Like you're alchemizing it, and you can when it comes up, right? But cannabis is actually what allowed me to see through that story and be like, wait a minute, like I tear up at like movies. Like actually this is fine, So like I've had that instance so many times where like on one degree it's subtle, right? Like you just have like a glimpse of like, oh, that's not really real. But like if our whole lives are really just collections of stories, then is that so subtle to have a certain story in your life completely shift and pivot, And that's been really interesting for me. And yeah. And I 100% feel you that the number one issue I deal with when I'm working with my students in, the collective or anything that I do with cannabis is shame and guilt, right? And even I still deal with it. Like there are certain times where I will just notice completely unconsciously, someone asks me, oh, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I'm a transformation coach. And Rachel will be like, why the fuck didn't you say cannabis coach? And I'm like, oh shit, why did I say that? And like the story I tell is like, it's fucking confusing. I didn't want to have to sit there for 5 minutes and explain what a cannabis coach is, but, and that is true on one degree, but at the same time, like I can feel the energy of like, okay, yeah, I was just tired and didn't want to explain it versus like, no, actually there was something there, and that's been really beautiful because if I still have it, like if I still have glimpses of it here and there, I'm like, what are most people living like? So it's interesting for sure.
Oh, they're drenched in it, like this. So in our training program, and we gotta change it a little bit because we're bringing in other medicines now. But we do an art experiential where we just invite people to draw out what were you taught about medicine by society and it's like, and all these ingrained belief systems just start coming out, and we're just like holding it and think it's totally normal, and it's not. It's debilitating, So like, and just to go back to what you're saying, Ryan, like I don't cry. There's something wrong with me. And what about the possibility of like, actually, I'm really happy, and that's okay,
Yeah.
Like we shame or judge positive things. And because society, we're not supposed to feel good, we're supposed to feel average or something. So I think there's a lot of reframing we have to do, and an assumption shifting or something,
Oh, definitely. It's so true. I mean, like that's one of the things, right? Like when I was going to a lot of retreats, and even like I just got back from a Kabbalah retreat, right? So like when I was there, this was like, different man, different river type thing, right? So I was aware of this now, like this story I've been aware of for the last couple of years, right? And I've seen how like, it's just funny. Like it actually, this all really came to a head specifically. I had the glimpses with cannabis, and then I got to have the full experience with psilocybin where I just like, when you're just fully connected and you're like getting the answers, but you don't have to actually speak them out loud, because if you do, then everything starts going away. So I remember like having this moment where I was like, oh, that's why I don't cry. Like laughter is the same thing as crying. And then as soon as I said that, I started laughing, and then I started crying. And it was like the medicine showing me like, see, they're the same thing, man. Like, and at the same time, just like you were saying, like, yeah, what if I'm actually really happy? And what if I've been conditioned to believe that no one could ever be this happy? Like no one could ever cry this little, like there's got to be something wrong with me. That's conditioning and programming as well, And so it's been so interesting because again, you just don't know what you don't know. And that's why I love cannabis and other psychedelics, because I am not naive enough to think that, oh, I've got myself figured out. Right. Like I like to every once in a while, even if I feel really good, be like, am I missing something? Like I'm curious, because my approach to everything is yes. And like, yes, I can be doing great. And I know I can be doing even better. Right. And so like, that's the approach I take with any medicine, and at this point, like you were saying, like cannabis is my ride or die a couple times a week. Beautiful. Right. Sometimes I do a whole week. Sometimes I take 4 weeks off. Right. It doesn't matter. Just depending on what time I'm feeling. Psilocybin, usually once or twice a year. Microdoses very often, compared to that. But like a big experience once, maybe twice a year. maybe 1 or 2 LSD experiences. And then, if I get up to Boulder, I'll definitely do a DMTX experience with you. But, it's like, I don't need a lot anymore because I've integrated so much that my life has become a psychedelic experience in many ways, and I've gotten back into that. Like, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must first enter the mind of a child. Most days I'm pretty much in the mind of a child, but I do, like any human, get stuck sometimes. And why suffer when I can just get behind the veil, figure it out, come back, integrate it, keep going on, super interesting.
Yeah. And I think so that, that protocol, right, or that frequency of use really points to someone who's already done a lot of work and has already broken through and done a lot of their healing. Right. And so, and I go back and forth wondering where I'm at in my healing process, because there always seems to be more, right? But like, it's not critical, right? And then some people, what we found is that some people need a few medicine experiences really short together to break through to another space. And so like, it's like almost like a clinical intervention. And then after that, like, it's like a sacrament. You're not supposed to take a sacrament just once in your life, right? You're supposed to return to the sacrament and sit with it, and honor it. And so in that with psychedelics, it's not like a fake sacrament or a sacrament that's just symbolic. You can actually take it and it has a major impact on your internal world, your internal psyche. So I think it's appropriate to reconnect with that space on an ongoing basis. And for me, cannabis is the workhorse, right? Like, and it's not neurologically as impacting as the other medicines, right? So it can be done very frequently and safely. And then because we have this workhorse, we don't have to use psilocybin every month or the other big medicines every month. So it's important to like work with a variety of medicines if we can, like allies. Definitely. It's like having multiple coaches. Like, why wouldn't you want multiple coaches, multiple perspectives, right?
100%.
And it's a privilege. Let's just like really acknowledge like the privilege of being able to access these medicines. And so there's like what I think what you're doing here. How do we create greater access in a way that's healthy? Not just like put LSD in the water supply like the hippies were like planning in the 60s or whatever. But like, I don't think that's a good idea. But like, how do we increase safe access? I think is critical at this point in our world. People are crying for alternatives to this mainstream lifestyle.
100%. I think we're definitely seeing like, because again, if you look at it spiritually, we're like, what does, Kabbalah say? What is all these different things that I train and say? And I'm sure you've heard it too. It's like the consciousness of the planet is rising, right? And the analogy I use often is like, we're at the stage of that rising process right now where let's imagine that you've had a dark room in your house that you haven't gone in years, maybe ever, and you decide to go in there and click on the light for the first time. What's the first thing you're going to notice? How fucking messy the room is and how much work it's going to take to get it back to where you want it to be. That's where the collective at large is. But there's a lot of people that maybe got that reminder to open that door before, like the whole collective did. And so there's a lot of us that have been in there cleaning. And yeah, the room's still a mess, but at the same time, we know like, well, I've already made the room look a lot better. So it's just a matter of time. The example you were using too of like the people that have done a lot of healing work versus people that, maybe haven't yet, like the analogy that came to me. I don't know why the universe speaks to me in food analogies, but it's kind of like this, right? Like if you're making a meal, right? I'm going to use a meat example again, but if you're making like tacos, right? There's a lot of people that are missing the meat. Tacos are not going to be the same if you have no meat inside, right? Then there are other people that are just missing the seasoning, right? So like, okay, cool. Like, you're missing the seasoning. It might be like a little weird, but like, they're still going to be tacos. You know what I mean? So like, that's I don't know how these analogies come to me, man. Like hilarious. That proves that God, universe, whatever you want to call it, has a sense of humor. But that's how I picture it. It's like a lot of us just might be missing the seasoning or might have the seasoning sometimes, but like, oh, fuck, I forgot to buy some seasoning packets. This actually happens to me quite frequently. So it's like a personal example. But again, like, that's where cannabis comes in real handy, I find, is like there are things that cannabis is really good at that I don't feel other medicines are as good at, and vice versa, right? Like psilocybin, if I want to go really fucking deep, right? Like 5 grams of mushrooms will do that, right? Cannabis is more spot treatment, like it's more like, and again, I could go deep with it. It's just a little bit messier to go really deep with, but these days I'm craving much more of like the spot treatments than I am those big experiences. Because again, like I'm very grateful. I've done quite a bit of work on myself and my life is awesome. And there's a lot of things going on. And I know that I don't have a lot of time to integrate those big experiences, but I can definitely connect with the plant, spend an hour integrating, be like, all right, back to normal, you know? So it's really cool you bring that up.
Yeah.
Sure.
Cannabis is great for that. So, you know, just like keep working with this analogy, like why clean a room with I'm trying to think of some analogy, like this room analogy that you're describing. Once you clean it, you don't need to do the extreme cleaning, right? Like you just need to tend it. You just need to, you know, put stuff up every now and then, dust it on occasion, turn the light, maybe do some sage, you know, like that. And that's with the cannabis, you know, but there are spaces. It's interesting. Everybody wants to do psilocybin now that it's legal, and I sit with these people who are wanting to do psilocybin, and it's more often than not I'm like, yeah, cannabis could actually really help you with this more than psilocybin would, but they're just so ingrained in this idea that it's only psilocybin that will help. It will only be that deep clean, and I prefer if a lot of people's rooms like that, the lights are off, and that's where they stuff everything. It's not a neutral space that they're avoiding. It's like actually that's where they're stuffing all the really like messes in their lives that they don't want to look at. So when you flip that light on, like say psilocybin requires you to flip that light on and look through every single box at once. Whereas cannabis is like, we're going to flip this light on gently. Maybe it's a little dimmer switch. We can softly look at this. And then let's just very gently take one little box that you're drawn to look at and bring it out, clean it up, maybe put a little back in there and then be done. You know, with psilocybin, it's looking at all the boxes at once. And I think that can, like we were talking about the DMT, it's going to activate your sympathetic nervous system in a way that can be hard to do. And that maybe there's more skillful ways to step into the work, right? That's what we're playing with, because we have like a psilocybin clinic, say in Oregon or whatever, is only going to have access to psilocybin. So it's like a hammer and a nail. Like if all you have is a hammer and then everything's a nail. With us, we have access to 4 medicines now. And so we're just like, well, what would we recommend given all of the options available? And it doesn't often fit what the client thinks they need. And so sometimes, you know, if it's not unsafe, we'll be like, okay, we'll just do what you're called to do. And other times we're like, no, we're not giving you psilocybin. We're going to start with ketamine first, because that psilocybin is going to really be hard. And sometimes people are open to it, and other times people are like, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm going to go find a psilocybin journey. Like, okay, you know, I trust that's what you need, but I can't participate in that, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, 100%. Oh, it makes perfect sense. And, you know, I like the addition of the room analogy you made, because like, think about it this way, right? If you have this room that you're throwing all your stuff into, and like maybe part of you unconsciously knows, like, I'm holding some stuff in. You might even not know what room it's in, but you don't really maybe have a lot of confidence that you can ever figure this out, right? Like, let's think about the average individual that has like a lot of these skeletons in their closet, and they've maybe tried therapy before, they've maybe tried some things, maybe they haven't. But at whatever point, they're obviously coming to psychedelics because part of them is like, I don't know what to do, right? So if you get tasked with dealing with everything in that room right off the bat, well, you don't have a level of confidence to actually be able to like motivate yourself that like, no, I can fucking do this, right? But if you take one little box at a time and you get that box done and you're like, oh shit, all right, yeah, I feel better. Okay, let me take another little box. Right?
You get a momentum going. Yeah, that's exactly it.
Exactly.
That's where integration comes in, and that skill development. It like opening a box and sorting through all your old mess. It actually has a skill. And I think you can develop that skill over and over again. And then the other thing about that room is that underneath all of that box is like a treasure, and you don't even know what that treasure is, because it's been hidden and protected for so long underneath all that trash. You don't even know what it is, but you know, like some people like have this innate felt sense that it's there, right? And so a lot of the times people who are coming, especially for psilocybin now, they have a major problem in their life that they're working to help heal, or they need help. They've probably done therapy, and that's helped to some degree, but they've never like felt completion with it. And then the other thing that is as alive in their bodies and in their mind is, what am I called to do in my life? What really matters? And they think that somehow psilocybin, or they've read of something that psilocybin or psychedelics in general can help with both of those things. And often, it's like there is a certain amount of courage that comes with this, right? Like, or this desire to do it. But sometimes it's not courage, it's like despair. I've tried everything else and it hasn't worked. So therefore, I'm willing to try this really big thing that I've heard about, because I can't live the way I am anymore, right? And so, but it's always seems to be this twofer. There's something that they need to clean up. That room is full of trash and gunk. But two, it's not just about cleaning. It's like this deep longing. And that's what we orient to. It's like, okay, we can work with the trash and all that, but let's remember the longing, because that's what gets you through all those boxes,
Definitely. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And I like that ability to like view it through that lens, because that's exactly in my case, what it's been pretty much my whole life, right? It's like, what are these two aspects of my life? What do I need to let go of? And what do I want to choose to actually do either after that process or as that process is starting to unfold? Because, I think also like we've been trained to think like, well, the second you take something out of your backpack, you got free space, fill it again, And I think for a lot of people, like, at least in my case, like it was actually a process of subtracting and getting rid of like whatever you want to call it, trauma, healing, anything like that, that allowed me to have the space necessary to actually like think about like, what do I want my purpose to be? What is my purpose? These kind of things. And, if you're silent enough, right, and if you have less chatter, you can like really start tuning in and feel into those things, right? But I think a lot of people too, and this is one of the challenges I've seen with cannabis, and also like just like, again, it's not cannabis that has a challenge or psilocybin or any of these things, but people's viewpoints of them is they think that like, because they're used to like, you have a headache, take an Advil and there's no work that needs to be done, but your headache goes away, right? In a perfect world. So they end up thinking they bring that same mindset in the psychedelics, but they're like, well, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to release whatever, or I'm going to find my purpose and I don't have to do shit, right? And, although I'm not a religious person, very spiritual, but not religious, there's a great quote from the Quaker branch of Christianity that says, pray and move your feet, right? So like, I would surmise like the praying in this is like relevant to like the experience itself. But the moving your feet part is like, well, it's not just going to figure it out for you, right? It might give you a breadcrumb trail to follow, right? The same, like, again, this is why I love thinking about psychedelics in like a practical way. It's like a coach, right? Because a coach, even if they gave you the answer, that doesn't fix your life, right? Like they could say, you need to go quit that job, but nothing's going to change until you go in and quit the job, if that's what you feel is accurate, again. So it's very interesting. And that's, again, why I love having these conversations. I think a lot of people just don't know. Maybe they've never thought of this. Maybe they've never really like given it much thought. And as they do, they go, oh yeah, shit, actually, that doesn't make any sense. I was bringing that kind of mindset to it. Okay, I get it now, And I think that's like in the wild popularity, oh my God, go blast off all this stuff, right? Like, I think this is the stuff that's not as sexy, to talk about. And I think a lot of people forget it, but it leads to much sexier things. So yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Psychedelics aren't gonna give you everything you're looking for. It's like, I call it meeting spirit halfway, right? Like it give you an idea, but you have to step into it. You have to choose to step into it. And I think that's like has to do with consent. Like as psychedelics as allies, they're not going to impose way of doing something on you, right? Like a good ally is somebody who honors your boundaries, your pacing, but isn't gonna like do things for you. Because that's not personally empowering. Like everything about psychedelics is all about personal empowerment. So having somebody just gift you to the world isn't going to feel as meaningful as if you accomplished something or went through a challenge to receive it. And like an adventure, I always think about an adventure. Like when I was a kid, Indiana Jones was shit. And like, remember that one scene at the beginning where he finds that little golden head and he has to go through all these booby traps to get there. And then as soon as he gets it, he's like loses it again. Right. There's meaning in the struggle. There's like, he had to go, like if he just was able to walk into a shopping center, pick up that golden head and walk out of it, right? Like there's no meaning in that. It was the adventure and the struggles that actually created the capacity and the endurance and the resiliencies to become a bigger and greater human being. And so like for me, working in the field of psychedelics, to me, the obstacles are the path because there's just so many of them in this field. And that I've just had to learn to accept that. Like it had been a while since I really felt that flow state of like manifesting something. But with DMTX, like, just like kind of like weirdly circle back to that. When we were gearing up to do our first DMTX experience, it was like this moment of like flow where the world would orient towards it. And all I had to do was take a step into it. And then the world would orient to the success again. I just take another step. But I had to buy the machine. I had to buy all the tubing. I had to check in with the people who were coming. Like Spirit's not going to do any of that. And if I hadn't done that, just waited for the DMTX to come to me, I would still be waiting. I would be like, that's that ego aggrandizement that I'm talking about. Like, oh, well, I'm talking about it. So that's the same thing as doing it. In reality, it was really hard to do it, so I think psychedelics are all about personal empowerment. And that means your coach isn't going to play the game for you, right? Like you got to get out there and play that game. And then learn how to kick or whatever it is. You got to kick 1,000 freaking times. And then maybe you're going to be good enough to play that game because other people are learning to kick too. Right. And maybe not everybody 100%. Wants to you succeed in the ways that you want to succeed. Right. But to me, makes it worthwhile, as an adventure, as long as it's not overwhelming, as long as it's not like really unsafe. I like the challenge of it,
Oh, definitely. There's a balance to anything, right? And like that's what I figured out too, because what can happen is, when you get this stuff and you get like, okay, yeah, I definitely want to make sure that I'm in alignment with what I'm looking to manifest and like my practices around that, but I also want to make sure that I'm like moving my feet too. What can happen is like gym's another perfect analogy, right? Like, someone might be able to think about like, being jacked if that's what they want to be, right? And they start going to the gym and at first they're like, oh, I fucking hate this. But after a while, you like really start to love getting in there and you're like, it's not even a workout if I don't get a burn. But then what happens when that person starts going, I'm going to go 2-3 times a day. Like I'm obsessed now with the work. Then it becomes out of balance too. Then it becomes overwhelming. It's not sustainable, right? So like there is a balance, right? Because if you would try to do DMTX, say 6 years ago, and you're like, you know what, we're going to change all the laws. We're going to do everything all ourselves, right? It would have been aggressively overwhelming, right? So what did you do? You set yourself up and you did the exact right amounts at the right time to be able to now be at this point where you can do it, and that's like the balance that I think a lot of people get out of balance. I mean, I know I have for sure in many different areas of life, not just with psychedelics, and I've had to really be careful of like, for instance, we built 3 programs in 2 years. Like that was aggressive, like I've realized like, okay, that was probably a little bit much, but at the same time, like I learned a lot from it, and I also learned like this entire Kabbalah experience I just had really illuminated like, oh shit, I watched my parents do because they didn't believe they deserved love if they didn't do. And when things were good, that might have been easy to hide. But as soon as the recession hit, all of a sudden, oh shit, we can't do as much. Oh shit, now everything is getting weird. And so I realized like, oh, that's the same pattern I'm running. So again, I was grateful that I was able to find that out because now I can talk about it, right? I can, heal it in myself and I can hopefully resonate with other people that have had that. But at the same time, like if you don't have time, like by yourself, with yourself to actually subtract and feel into this stuff, it's going to be hard to do that, So yeah, it's very interesting stuff.
Well, I mean, just like a muscle, it has to rest for it to grow. Like that's where a muscle actually builds itself is when you rest. And so if all you're doing is work out, or building a program, then there's some like I built multiple programs in a real short period of time and it just about did me in, so like that's great. Like a sprint is really great, but you're not going to be able to maintain that. And as a medicine person, like, and I think you can relate to this too, you have to turn inward. That's where the inspiration comes from. That's where the rejuvenation comes from. And I tell people every expedition needs a safe harbor. Like you have to come back to a place that you can rest a little bit. And so I think, like heroic effort is really wonderful. And I've done it. And after accomplishing DMTX, it's like And there are so many hurdles. Like we just couldn't do it until like the law, like literally my whole reality and legal framework in Colorado had to change. Like it was so beyond what I could do that I would not have been able to do it previously. And I told people after we did 7 journeys on our first retreat, I told people that was so hard. If I had tried to do that when I thought we were going to do it several years ago, I would not have been able to make it through. You know, as a guide, it was one of the most meaningful experiences I've ever had, but also energetically hardest. And it took 7 years of intentional work and hardship to spend a few days with people. And then I had to rest after that. Like there was no way I could have moved forward. It took everything we had. Like sometimes there are these things where you have to invest everything you have to accomplish it, right? You can't put, what do they say? Don't leave anything on the field, right? That's exactly what DMTX was like for us. And it was worth it. It was worth it. But it's because we won, you know, we did it. It was, you know, yeah, it was great.
I mean, think about it, right? Like how many Star Wars movies, at least originals, did it take to get to Return of the Jedi, right? Like it wasn't like a 10-minute thing of like, there's this guy, he's supposed to do good stuff. He just goes up to Darth Vader when Darth Vader's got his back turned, cuts his head off, and the movie's over. That's it. You know, it's like, that's not fucking exciting. Yeah. Like, you know, everyone loves a good hero's journey. Yeah.
It makes exactly. The hardships make it worth it. And make the boon or the gift or the treasure valuable, right? Like, again, if somebody gives it to you, it's just not gonna be as impactful. And some things are meant to be life-changingly difficult, right? The world's not supposed to always be easy. That doesn't mean though we can't be in flow with that like desire to excel. It doesn't mean we have to sacrifice, like you're describing your family. You know, like that's not quite like I have a lot of ingrained stuff like that too. Like workaholic, like you can be a workaholic in a good field, but it's still not good for your system. So I'm learning self-care is like, again, I talk about self-care all the time to people. And then I'm also realizing just how much self-care I need just to be okay, you know, and that's okay. Right. Like I'm a human, I'm a flesh thing, right? Like we're humans and we know we have to eat every now and again. So we're not just spirits.
No, 100%. That's been the ultimate thing for me because in human design, right, I'm a projector and I've loved human design. I think it's been very practical for at least me in my life. And my not self theme is bitterness. And it took me a long time to realize like that feeling that I thought was frustration or anger was actually bitterness, right? And I got no one to blame. Like, you know, again, like it was illuminating. Like when you create your own business, right? Like there's no one telling you when you're done for the day, right? So if you think you're not enough, right? You have that story running, then there's no limit to how much you'll try to do to get over that, right?
So you're never going to stop working.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like literally the last 3 years I've been running that pattern. And so just the other day, like I've had glimpses obviously and done things, but the other day was like a full realization of like, oh shit, okay, now I'm going to go home and do something about this, you know? And so it's been amazing just like, you know, pulling back, closing my calendar off quite a bit and being like, listen, like, you know, I just did a 3-year push of just like 7 days a week aggressive, you know, and now like, you know, it's also summer here. I get 3 months a year to like be outside. I told Alex, my business partner, and everyone for the rest of the summer, like I'm just keeping what I'm going, like, you know, going like cruise control, and I'll return to projects come October 1st, you know, like I'm good. So yeah, it's cool stuff.
You have to do that, Ryan. Like, you know, so I've been on that pace for 12 years now and just realizing, because I love the work. Like this is, again, like there's nothing wrong with the passion. There's nothing like I get to do what I love. Like, why wouldn't I want to do it all the time? Right. But then I, you know, like, what about my family? Like, what about my children? Like, what about my own physical health and well-being? These matter so much. And like community, right? Like, I want to experience the joy of having the accomplishment as opposed to just always being in it. And so I fully support your desire to like plateau a little bit. Like, what if it's okay to be on a plateau for a little while? You're still moving forward. It's just like you're not climbing up a freaking mountain right now, you know? So I'm trying to plateau more. I think that's a really good Like, what do you mean don't grow as quickly or as fast? It's like, no, I think I'm okay. Like, that is the growth. That is the healing, to slow down. That is the place you want to be, is a place of okayness as things are. Like, I wish that for everybody on the planet. Like, I want that for people. That's what would the world look like if we could all just be in an okay, well enough space? Like, what a celebration that would be,
Yeah. Like if you're always just running the races, right? Like you never get to stop for a second and go, holy shit, I just ran that race. That was pretty fucking cool, right?
Celebrate. You got to celebrate it, right?
Yeah.
Like you gotta have victory. You got to feel the accomplishment, and that takes some time. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely. And you also get to go smoke the metaphorical or maybe literal joint with like the rest of the people that ran the race with you and be like, holy shit, we all just did that. It's fucking awesome. High five, celebrate your wins together. It's like, that's what I realized that I was not giving myself enough time to do. And without that, right, like that's how you build more confidence, because you actually remember like, holy shit, I just did that. And if I did that, I can now do this next thing. But if you always just stay in it, it's going to create, at least for me, like bitterness over time. And I got no one to blame for that except myself. But again, it was a great learning experience. I see it as being like, it's the number one issue that I see people like this should have, told me a long time ago, but like typically when people come to me, they're in a very similar state. And, of course, like what you were talking about a while back with objectivity, I do believe there is some objectivity. Like if you look at the 7 Hermetic principles, right? And like these kind of like universal laws, like law of resonance. Why was I getting so many people who were having challenge slowing down if I wasn't having a similar challenge, right? Like, so it's been really fun to be able to see that. And I like, and that's the thing. It's been fun. Like, it's been fun to be like, oh, like, that's where I was missing, like, being able to stop and smell the roses. And that's awesome too, because at that point, I wasn't ready yet. Like I had to go through that just the same way that Luke had to get his ship stuck in the mud to be able to discover his true power with Yoda, right? Like, all of our challenges are there to help us and allow us to learn and grow and become more self-aware. If we choose to view them like that, that's where, again, things are subjective, right? Someone could just go, woe is me, right? And as someone who's done both, I know now through discernment which one I prefer, and I prefer the empowering one, so I can tell like right now I'm in that phase where like, it's, again, it's a pit stop, not a rest stop, but I'm like, for like 5 or 6 weeks, I'm going to go plateau and just chill, keep the podcast going, keep teaching the classes, but not write anything new, and then September, October is my creative season anyway. Something about Halloween just always makes me creative. So we're making a break dependency course.
And the more you know your flow, right, the more you know when you're good at something, then you can prepare for it and not be worn out when you get to that space. I think it's really great. And, like the sense of accomplishment. Sometimes though, again, sometimes we want to be mindful of like some of the privilege that we work through. Like some people, and myself included, that we're migrating to a new way of living or even migrating to a new paradigm or world. And some people are physically migrating, so like when you're taking your family to a new world, whatever that means, you can't just take a break in the middle of it, right? It requires real effort and to get to that place. But once you get there, you have to put the sword down. You have to take the backpack off. And I think for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been in that space of really attempting to migrate to another whole worldview. And there was no way I could take the backpack off because my family depended on us succeeding in this space. And now after I live in a world right now, like Colorado, where psilocybin, mescaline, non-peyote mescaline, DMT, and even ibogaine and cannabis and ketamine are all legal now, right? And so I have to okay, what else is there to accomplish? It's more about just living into what we're already doing. And that's a different place of seeking. It's like, I'm no longer seeking. What I sought was here now. Yeah. And so the real work is, okay, how do I cultivate this as a garden? And if I water it 50,000 times a day or, do too much tending, it's not going to thrive. And so now it's like, okay, what if we just paused and breathed and then just played in this space for a little while? Not try to accomplish. And for me, that's been a major shift in my mindset that I'm still trying to orient to,
Oh, definitely. It's like the pool analogy, right? Like I don't use pools with chemicals, but let's just say, for instance, I did. Like, my dad, for instance, right? When my dad was alive, he was like the ultimate, like took care of the yard, right? Like did the pool at my parents' house, all these things, right? So we would spend all this time uncovering the pool, making sure the water was perfect, chlorine, putting chlorine in it, putting shock in it, all these things, right? But very little did he actually get in the pool and sit on a float and just relax in it, right? And like sit into like what he had helped create, right? So again, he got a lot of joy by helping the pool like actually be full enough and, allow the kids to go in it when we were younger, things like that. But again, like there was that part he was missing. And I noticed that same pattern in myself. And that's like, again, it was the perfect time for me to recognize it. That's why I did, right? And again, like, that's kind of the thing is like, if you watch like Yellowstone or maybe not Yellowstone, but like the 1883, right? Like the prelims or, prequel to that, in that they don't really know where they're going. They're just going west, right? But then they find the spot and they just know when they found it, right? And they're like, okay, we're building our settlement here, right? So I love that you're talking about this because I think it is very intuitive. Like that's where I felt like, ooh, I'm feeling very bitter. Why am I feeling like that? Oh, because it's time to actually stop for a little while and just like, do a gauge check, like how is everything looking? Yeah, exactly. Enjoy the pool. Swim for a little while.
Swim for a little bit, that's like so necessary. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%.
Our fathers, they work so hard and for us that they sometimes, and I have to pay attention to this now as a father, to not give everything that we can give so that we can have something ourselves. And that we deserve that, as human beings, as fathers or whatever that is, that we can be part of the enjoyment. But what does it look like to put yourself into the equation and then to be around people who also put you into the equation as opposed to you always being the one to put others into your equation, right? Like there's something necessary about that. And if you're not going to accomplish as much because of that, then maybe that's actually healthier than all of that accomplishment, right? And then there's spaces that like if you're migrating or you're settling in a new territory or whatever, like there are definitely places where you can't put down the tools. You have to stay on top of it. But what does it look like to find that safe harbor again? You have to do it. And that's something I'm learning again and again and again, that we're human beings. We're not superheroes. It's okay to be broken a little bit and not perfect a little bit, or your body doesn't function as well as it used to a little bit or whatever, right? Like it's okay to be human in this space. And that it's, even if the world feels like it's falling apart all around you, like what would it look like to pause and breathe? And then sometimes we need a little intervention. That's where cannabis might come in. Like, okay, like, help support me in finding my regulated space again in this bigness. And she'll do that for you, right? Like we have allies. We don't have to do it all on our own. We have a plethora of allies to support us. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm super grateful for that. So.
Yeah, me too, man. Me too. Daniel, this has been amazing, man. I could keep talking to you all day. We're going to have to do a part 3 to this. We didn't even, I wanted to ask you about cannabis and ketamine too, but we'll save that for next time. I know we'll have a lot to chat about.
Yeah, I'm up for that.
Hell yeah, man. Because I get questions all the time, about those two things together. Very interesting.
Well, the short answer is it's safe. And, in a clinic like ours, we have limitations around mixing medicines, but it's a really safe combination and it makes it very DMT-like. I love the combination of those two medicines, but I'd be happy to share some like real specific advice on how to work with them together, and just because like I can't do it in my clinic, because the laws or legality of, combining two medicines, heaven forbid.
I know, right?
It's funny, some of the constraints we have, but it's a lovely experience. And I would, if I could, I would recommend it.
Yeah. Someone who isn't me, the old swim analogy from Blue Light and like all those like, psychedelic forums. Swim says that it's a good combination. And that's, again, like everyone I've talked to about it is basically like, it like will straight up give you a Kundalini awakening, right? And like that term is like, charged and said a lot. But I think really what it does is it allows you to access the heart in this very unique way. And cannabis allows like, your posture, like I don't think it's actually posture, but the word that comes to me that describes what I'm trying to get at is like the posture of the body gets aligned with cannabis, and the ketamine allows you to get deep within yourself, or deep outside of yourself rather, enough to allow whatever alchemical process is possible to happen. And I've had many people be like, dude, like that is like one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had, you know? So yeah, it's interesting. I've only experimented with it twice in very small amounts just to test the waters. And I found some very powerful things there. And I haven't had the time to dedicate to really like, okay, I got like 6 hours, let's really go in, but I'm very curious. So glad to hear it's safe.
yeah, it seems to be. Let's open it up, the conversation, talking about that and how to use cannabis with other medicines and stuff. I think it's really essential. Cool. So I'm happy to connect again, Ryan.
Hell yeah. I think that's actually like a great podcast idea, right? Like how to utilize cannabis with other medicines. Like, let's plan that out immediately. So I'll send you an email and we'll get that hooked up. But sure. Daniel, I got one last question for you, man. First of all, where can people find you once again? For anyone who hasn't checked out the episode that Daniel and I did back in February, I believe it's episode 96 on this podcast. Definitely check that out. But where can people find you, man? Where can they find out more about DMTX? About the work you do with cannabis, everything medicinal mindfulness does. Tell the people where they can find you, man.
Yeah, thanks. So our clinic is the Center For Medicinal Mindfulness, medicinalmindfulness.org. And if you're interested in our services, there's an inquiry form. Super easy, and you talk to somebody for free. And a lot of people come for visits. It's not just local folks. We specialize in like week-long intensives with like multiple medicines, and really lovely. So if you're really looking for some support or struggling, that's where I would go. For those of you who are interested in like learning how to guide with medicines, we have a training program called Psychedelic Sitterschool.org, and get on the newsletter and stay connected. So we're in the process of, still cannabis is our primary, but now we're bringing in 3 other medicines to the training program: Psilocybin, DMT, and ketamine. So it's a really, like, it's pretty far out that we're doing this. And then DMTX.org. There's a wonderful little video. I would recommend people watching DMTX.org, and right on the top, there's a video you can watch about the process. And what you're going to want to do is get on the newsletters for all of these things. And that way you'll stay in contact of like the big things coming up. So we have some constraints around advertising some of the things we do publicly, but we can share everything in the newsletter. So that would be the best way to stay connected. So
beautiful.
That's what I would do. Yeah. Yeah, right on.
Yeah, guys, definitely take that advice. Yeah, definitely hop on the newsletter. Daniel's work is fucking awesome. It's really cool. And Daniel, I got one last question for you, man. And I already asked you the original one, so I'm going to modify it for this show, and we'll see how it comes out. I'm going to think of it on the spot. So, yeah. So let's say someone is specifically interested in diving into psychedelic medicines, right? What is the one piece of advice you would offer them as to where to start, right? Maybe they're hearing this episode, they're like, ooh, cannabis, ketamine, DMT, psilocybin, right? Like, what would you suggest in terms of like, how to figure out or discern what medicine may be right for them, right? And I know this is obviously a bigger question, but just whatever first comes to heart and mind about it.
Well, one, I think the interest is healthy. So sometimes we have judgment around drugs are bad or whatever, right? Or like, maybe I shouldn't do this, it was illegal. First, you're on the right track. Trust your intuition, trust that calling, trust that curiosity, and maybe like follow the thread of it. Like, what are you, like you read up, what are you most interested in? What are you most drawn to? Just keep following the thread and explore. And then if you've never done a psychedelic, if it's cannabis might more likely than not might be legal where you are, and that there's ways to work with cannabis intentionally as a psychedelic. And so your program would be a good example of this, but also like I wrote my book, Psychedelic Cannabis, where I teach people how to step into this work safely. So I wouldn't bypass cannabis if you're interested in psilocybin, because I think or ayahuasca, like a lot of people going to Costa Rica or wherever to do your first Aya journey, like that might be all they realize they can do. And that's okay. But I think if you're not quite sure about taking that huge leap, stepping in, working with cannabis would be the place I would really I invite people to do. Another area that people are looking at as an option is ketamine clinics, right? And so, that's a hit or miss space, because some places who offer ketamine offer no clinical or spiritual support. And it's very medicalized, and like that beautiful experience might be a happy byproduct for some of those experiences. So if ketamine is the only thing legal in an area, then maybe I would kind of like get to know what type of ketamine clinic it is. If it's hyper over medicalized, I would ask about support. Do you have somebody in the room with you that's trained as a guide, or is it just the nurse giving you an IV or a shot and leaving the room? And so I would be mindful of the ketamine clinics if you're new to this. So plant medicine, cannabis, it's everywhere. I can't, gosh, sometimes it's worth doing something illegal if you really need it, and it's, you need life-changing. But I think with cannabis, it's probably the safest legally, and come to Colorado, we'll support you, so that would be my thought of folks who are just starting out. It's okay.
No, that is
maybe
perfect.
That's the piece is like, really, I would truly honor your curiosity in this and learn that that's a beautiful thing. I've learned to trust people in that.
Yeah, I love that, man. It's very sound advice. I mean, guys, even if I imagine everyone listening to this podcast already is aware of this, but an imaginary line on paper does not make something magically unsafe. So if people are realizing, right, if research and all of these things are proving with actual science, and of course the spiritual knowledge as well, that psilocybin, cannabis, ketamine, DMT, ayahuasca, these things are powerful, nothing's going to say that, if it's illegal in my state, that means it's bad. No, the science is actually out, right? That's just politics being politics, right? So, wow, guys, I am always blown away when speaking with Daniel. His dedication and devotion to not only the work he has been doing for the past 10 years, but also continuing to stretch his comfort zone and open up new possibilities within the psychedelic space is truly inspiring. For any of you looking to connect with Daniel, attend the Center for Medicinal Mindfulness, and stay up to date on all of his latest creations, make sure to dive into the show notes for this episode, where I will be laying out all of the easiest ways to do so today. Daniel, thank you so much once again for all of the incredible work you have done and are continuing to do in this space, for always being down to have an amazing conversation with me and the listeners on the show, and for setting the standard for what professionalism looks and operates like within the psychedelic space. And until next time, my brother, may your journey be smooth and full of light. Aho.